I want you to imagine a world where a physical disability is just completely written into history as a divine curse.
Yeah, literally cemented as a curse.
Right. And I want you to imagine that an entire advanced, highly cosmopolitan civilization is reduced to a footnote of just barbaric villains purely to make the victors look good.
It's basically a massive smear campaign.
Exactly. You were taught that they were the bad guys, when in reality, they were simply on the losing side of a massive geopolitical PR campaign. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore excerpts from this really fascinating text called Aurora Green, specifically Chapter 1.
And this text, it's wild. It takes the incredibly well-known biblical story of Esau, Jacob, and the Edomites, and it just completely flips it on its head.
It really does. He uses ancient history, archaeology, and even medical genetics to re-examine how patriarchal power structures created these narratives of scapegoating that, honestly, we still use today.
We absolutely do. It's a radical reframing of a foundational human story. We often look at ancient history as this settled ledger of facts, but this text kind of forces us to see the forged entries.
Yeah, the edits in the margins. But before we jump in, I want to be crystal clear with you, the listener. This text touches on deeply religiously and politically charged themes.
Very charged.
Yeah, we're talking about historical conflicts between ancient Israel, Edom, Rome, and how those ancient archetypes are sometimes mapped onto modern groups. So, to be clear, we are not taking any sides here. We are not endorsing these viewpoints.
Right. Our goal is simply to look at the mechanics of the author's argument. We're strictly here to unpack the ideas in the source material. We just want to understand how his story evolves when you introduce modern science and archaeology into the mix.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how a biological condition gets turned into a divine curse, we can't just start with the family dispute between the two brothers, right? We have to look at the geopolitical pressure cooker their ancestors lived in.
You really have to zoom out.
Right, because the story happens in Canaan. And Bronze Age Canaan wasn't just some empty stage waiting for family drama.
No, not at all. Canaan was basically the ultimate strategic crossroads. You have to think of it like tectonic plates of civilization just grinding against each other.
It's just constant friction.
Exactly. You had the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Hurrian, and Hittite empires all trying to control these major trade routes running right through this super narrow strip of land.
So it's basically a network of heavily fortified independent city-states.
Yeah, and an environment defined by intense border anxiety and cultural collision.
Right. And into this settled urban environment come the Amorites.
Yes. So the name comes from the Akkadian word amuru, which translates roughly to Westerners. They were semi-nomadic pastoralists.
Meaning they lived in tents, they moved with their herds, that kind of thing.
And they eventually began migrating into these highly developed, walled Mesopotamian societies. The source highlights this ancient Sumerian myth called the marriage of Martu.
Oh, this part was so interesting.
It really is. It tells the story of a high-status city goddess who decides to marry Martu, who is this wild, nomadic, Amorite outsider.
And her friends in the myth try to warn her.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they complain that he doesn't know city manners, he eats raw meat, he doesn't even bury his dead properly.
Yeah, they view him as a total barbarian. But the myth isn't really a romance. It symbolizes a massive demographic shift in the ancient world.
Like an uptown girl meets country boy trope, but for actual geopolitics.
Exactly. It represents the historical tension and the eventual political blending between settled agricultural farmers and tribal nomads. The Amorites didn't just raid these cities, they assimilated.
They integrated into the culture.
Yeah, over generations, they founded powerful dynasties, like the First Babylonian Empire. So the myth was a way for the society to process these political alliances and the blending of radically different cultures.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense in a historical context, but I have to push back a little because it totally clashes with the biblical narrative I'm familiar with.
How so?
Well, the Bible explicitly talks about the sin of the Amorites. It associates them with extreme idolatry and child sacrifice. There's a passage where God tells Abraham his descendants can't inherit the land yet because the, quote, iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Right.
So it sounds way less like a blending of cultures and more like a justification for a holy war. Was that real or just ancient propaganda?
Well, this raises an important question. How much of a historical text is objective reporting and how much is theological framing written after the fact?
Right, the victor writing the history.
Exactly. Archaeology shows us that Canaanite society was actually highly advanced.
Yeah.
They had skilled metallurgy, complex international trade, and rich art. Now, did they have religious practices that later biblical writers found abhorrent? Yes.
Sure.
But the source argues that the concept of the sin of the Amorites essentially functions as a theological justification for a conquest narrative.
It's the ultimate rationalization.
Yeah.
Like, we didn't just take their land. God gave it to us because the previous tenants were irreversibly evil.
It creates a moral binary that justifies displacement. Though, to be fair to the nuance of the biblical text, Leviticus does include a pretty stark warning to the Israelites that if they adopted those same practices, the land would quote-unquote vomit them out too.
So it wasn't just a total blank check.
Right. But the underlying reality is that in this volatile region, preserving your specific tribal identity, your lineage, and your access to land was just a matter of sheer survival.
And that systemic need to protect the land and political alliances didn't just dictate foreign policy.
No, it went way deeper.
It dictated the most intimate parts of human life, like who you were allowed to marry. Which brings us to the bizarre and honestly tragic biology of Esau's birth.
Yeah, the timeline of this family is staggering when you actually look at the numbers.
It really is.
Yeah.
Isaac marries Rebekah specifically to keep the bloodline pure, completely avoiding the local Canaanite women. And the source brings in some fascinating ancient rabbinic texts to emphasize how transactional this was.
Yeah, the source cites the Seder Olam Rabbah, which is an ancient Jewish timeline, and it suggests Rebekah was 3 years old when she was chosen for Isaac.
Wait, 3. That is.
Yeah. Another text, the Book of Jasher, says she was 10.
Which is still deeply unsettling to hear today. But it drives home the point that marriage in the ancient Near East had absolutely nothing to do with romance or consent.
Nothing at all. It was a legally binding property arrangement, a mechanism for consolidating wealth, securing alliances, and preserving a very specific genetic lineage.
And following that timeline, the text says she experiences 20 years of barrenness.
Right, 2 decades.
In a culture where a woman's entire societal value is predicated on producing a male heir to inherit that wealth, that is 20 years of intense systemic pressure.
Unimaginable pressure.
And when she finally gets pregnant with twins, they are fighting so violently in the womb that she actually goes to inquire of God. And she receives this prophecy that 2 nations are in her womb, and the older will serve the younger.
And this is the pivot point in the source material. It shifts the lens completely away from theology and focuses entirely on the mechanics of genetics.
Because they were closely related, right?
Exactly. You have to remember, the patriarchs practiced consanguineous marriage. That's the clinical term for marrying close blood relatives. Abraham and Sarah were half-siblings. Isaac married his first cousin once removed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because of this intense inbreeding designed to keep their political power pure, they are basically playing a dangerous game of genetic roulette.
They absolutely are.
When the twins are born, Esau comes out first. And the text makes a huge deal about his physical appearance. He's born red, hairy, and covered in what looks like a thick, hairy garment.
Yeah, and the author identifies the specific biological description as matching a condition called ichthyosis.
Okay, what exactly is that?
It's an autosomal recessive genetic skin disorder. It basically causes dry, scaly, thickened skin that can literally look like fish scales. And it's often accompanied by redness and excessive hair growth.
Wow. Let's break down the mechanics of that. Autosomal recessive means that both parents have to carry the mutated gene, right?
Correct. When you have 2 carriers, there is a 25% chance with each pregnancy that the child will inherit both mutated copies and actually manifest the condition.
And because of the consanguineous marriage.
Exactly. Because of the inbreeding, the recessive genes hiding in their shared bloodline finally met. Jacob, being a fraternal twin, simply received a different genetic combination.
That is wild. It's a perfect parallel to royal European families, like the Habsburgs.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. They were so terrified of losing their grip on the throne that they just kept marrying their cousins and nieces. And we know now that it caused immense genetic harm, like the famous protruding Habsburg jaw.
Yeah, trying to keep the power pure actually poisoned the well.
Exactly. The tragedy here is that in a Bronze Age world, there's no Gregor Mendel. There's no understanding of Mendelian inheritance or recessive alleles.
None at all. They had no medical framework to process what they were seeing.
So in a world without genetics, they didn't see inheritance. They saw a monster. They saw a visible manifestation of divine wrath.
And if a society doesn't understand the science behind a tragedy, they demand a scapegoat.
Always.
When a child is born with a highly visible, misunderstood condition in an ancient patriarchal society, the blame does not fall on the marriage laws drafted by the men. The blame lands squarely on the mother.
which introduces the feminist critique in this text, which I thought was brilliant. It points out a massive cultural shift regarding how women were viewed.
Right, going from co-creators to property?
Exactly. In older, ancient goddess-worshipping cultures, like the early worship of the Canaanite god El and his consort Asherah, women were viewed as sacred co-creators. Their bodies were revered.
But as patriarchal monotheism began to take root and consolidate power, that feminine divine was actively erased.
And women were systematically reduced to property. They became mere vessels for male lineage.
And if that vessel produced a child deemed defective, the woman was blamed for it. She was accused of hidden sin or spiritual corruption or just angering the deity somehow.
Reading that made me completely rethink the Sunday school version of this story.
Hmm.
We're always taught that Rebecca was this scheming, deceitful mother who just arbitrarily played favorites with Jacob.
The classic villain narrative.
Right. But looking at the brutal reality of her society, I had a completely different realization. What if she wasn't scheming for power? What if she was just a terrified mom trying to protect her disabled son?
What's fascinating here is how the dominant patriarchal narrative completely erases her actual maternal trauma.
It really does.
Put yourself in her shoes. She gives birth, and the midwives recoil in horror. Her child's skin is cracking and scaly. The village is whispering that her womb is cursed. From day one, Rebecca knows that Esau's appearance makes him a massive target in a ruthless world.
Right, because if he were to take on the role of the tribal patriarch, he would be subjected to endless scrutiny. He could be challenged, exiled, or even killed by rivals who viewed him as a cursed leader.
Exactly the risk she would have foreseen, and the source suggests this brilliant, empathetic reframing of her actions. By orchestrating the theft of the blessing later in their lives, maybe Rebecca wasn't blindly favoring Jacob out of spite.
She was being strategic.
Exactly. Maybe she knew that forcing Esau into the lethal spotlight of tribal leadership would destroy him. She ensured that Jacob, who had the normal appearance and the social capital, would hold the seat of power, perhaps so he could be in a position to protect his vulnerable older brother.
By framing her purely as a villainous, manipulative woman, the patriarchal system never has to look in the mirror. It completely avoids questioning its own harmful inbreeding practices.
It's so much easier to say, the deceitful woman ruined the family, than to admit our obsession with bloodline purity is physically destroying our children.
Wow. The system that generated the genetic harm is never interrogated. The anxiety and the blame are entirely displaced onto the mother and the marked child.
Yes.
So this desperate need to navigate a system stacked entirely against them culminates in the most famous incident between the brothers, the trading of the birthright and the stolen blessing.
The lentil stew.
Yes, the classic summary goes like this. Esau, the rugged hunter, comes home from the wilderness completely starved. Jacob, the quiet, calculating brother who stays in the tents, is making a red lentil stew. Esau begs for the food, and Jacob essentially extorts him, demanding the birthright in exchange for a meal.
Right.
And then years later, when Isaac is blind and dying, Rebekah dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes and puts goat skins on his hands and neck to mimic the hairy skin. Isaac is tricked by the smell and the touch and gives Jacob the irrevocable blessing of wealth and leadership.
And the traditional theological reading of that event is that Esau despised his birthright.
Right, that's what we're told.
He's framed as a man of the flesh, driven by base appetites with zero spiritual foresight. The narrative tells us he willingly traded his eternal destiny for a bowl of soup.
See, I really have to push back on that traditional reading, especially given the historical context we're discussing.
I agree. It doesn't hold up.
Right.
Yeah.
We're told Esau despised it because he lacked foresight.
Yeah.
But wait, Esau is a nomadic hunter. His entire existence, his skill set, and his freedom are based on roaming the open wilderness.
Yes.
The birthright is an agricultural inheritance. Why on earth would a nomad want a legal deed that ties him to a specific plot of domesticated farmland? To a hunter, that isn't a blessing. That's a prison sentence.
That is a very astute observation. The text highlights that this isn't just a squabble over inheritance, it's a macro-level clash of human civilizations.
Like hunter-gatherer versus agriculture.
Exactly. It represents the painful transition from those hunter-gatherer societies to settled agricultural civilizations. In the ancient world, storing grain meant you needed walls. Walls meant you needed kings, and kings needed armies.
And if you don't want to live behind walls,
those who resisted the march of civilization, the nomads, the hunters, were routinely demonized by the people writing the histories inside the city walls.
But the source goes even darker than just a cultural clash, which I found so chilling. It points out that if Esau's primary condition ichthyosis, was accompanied by other genetic factors affecting his cognition or impulse control.
Then what we are watching isn't a moral failure, it's the exploitation of a vulnerable person.
Yes.
If Esau was neurodivergent or simply struggling with the compounding physical toll of his condition in a harsh environment, his impulsivity in a moment of starvation was weaponized against him by his own brother.
Jacob literally exploited a starving, disabled person. And then the text transforms that human manipulation into divine justice. It sanitizes the extortion by claiming God always wanted it this way.
It is a textbook example of retroactive justification.
It's so dark. And the justification for casting Esau out runs incredibly deep, tapping into these ancient cosmic symbols that get completely twisted depending on who holds the pen.
Right, the symbolism.
Yeah, we have to talk about the fish symbolism because this blew the whole narrative wide open for me.
It's a huge connection. So the medical term ichthyosis derives from the Greek word ichthys, meaning fish, because the thickened, dry skin visually mimics fish scales.
Wow.
And the source draws a stunning symbolic and astrological parallel between Esau and Jesus, because both historical figures are heavily marked by the archetype of the fish.
Right. I mean, it's impossible to ignore the Christian parallels once you see them. Jesus feeds the 5,000 with loaves and fishes. He calls his disciples to be fishers of men.
Exactly.
And the ichthys, that simple line drawing of a fish, was the secret symbol used by early Christians to identify each other safely during Roman persecution.
Yes, and to understand why the fish is so potent, you have to look at what it represents in ancient cosmology. Water is the ultimate boundary. It separates the world of the living from the deep, chaotic abyss. A fish lives entirely within that different element, crossing the boundaries of the surface. So they're symbols of profound transformation, moving between the material and the spiritual realms.
And biologically speaking, Esau wore this cosmic symbol of transformation and boundary crossing on his literal skin.
Exactly. And astrologically, there's a massive shift happening around this time as well.
The age of Pisces, right?
Yeah. In astrology, the precession of the equinoxes moves us through different ages. The age of Pisces, the sign of the fish, began roughly around the time of Jesus' birth and ministry. It ushered in an era defined by spiritual transformation, the dissolution of old boundaries, and the rise of universalizing religions.
So if we step back, both Esau and Jesus are fundamentally boundary crossers, bearing the exact same fish archetype.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, look at how differently the archetype is treated by the narrative. Jesus' fish symbolism served the new emerging theology of the early church.
So it was elevated as sacred?
Right, codified and revered. But Esau's fish-scaled skin threatened the established patriarchal inheritance system of his era. Because he disrupted the system, his fish symbol was demonized as monstrous and impure.
The symbol is exactly the same. The only difference is the power structure dictating the PR.
Exactly.
If you're a tool for the new system, your fish makes you a savior. If you threaten the old system, your scales make you a curse.
It perfectly illustrates how symbols are manipulated to serve power rather than objective truth.
Man, that is eye-opening. So Esau is cast out, he loses his birthright, his blessing is stolen, and he receives this secondary, really bleak decree from his father that he will live by the sword.
Right.
He's entirely villainized by the text, wanders off into the desert, and becomes the father of the Edomites. If you only read the biblical account, you would walk away believing Edom was just a barren wasteland filled with angry barbarians waiting in the rocks to ambush people.
Yeah, that's the picture it paints.
Okay.
But history and modern archaeology tell a wildly different story, a story the ancient authors actively tried to bury.
So what actually happened to Esau's descendants?
Well, the Edomites were absolutely not a cursed wasteland of barbarians. They actually built a wealthy, highly sophisticated, cosmopolitan civilization.
Really? How did they manage that in a desert environment?
Through immense industrial and logistical mastery.
Yeah.
Like archaeological excavations at sites like Purbat and Nahas have uncovered massive industrial-scale copper mining and smelting operations.
Wow.
In the Iron Age, copper was the equivalent of oil today. It was the crucial resource for weapons, tools, and wealth. The Edomites ran a smelting operation so massive that the smoke would have been visible for miles.
That's incredible.
Furthermore, they strategically controlled the incredibly lucrative trade routes pulling incense and myrrh up from Arabia into Egypt and the Mediterranean.
So they weren't barbarians at all. They were basically a booming megacorporation.
Pretty much.
And the source mentions their connection to Petra, right? The famous city carved directly into the rose-red cliffs of southern Jordan.
Yes. So while the Nabateans are famous for perfecting the architecture of Petra later on, the Edomites and their descendants were the earlier inhabitants of that region. They established the foundations of that rock-cut architectural tradition and integrated themselves into the wider Mediterranean economy.
Okay, here is the historical irony that I'm just still trying to wrap my head around.
Prepare yourself.
Right. The source details the Herodian dynasty under Roman rule. It points out that the Herods were Edomians, which is the Greco-Roman name for the descendants of Edom.
Yep.
Meaning Herod the Great, the immensely powerful Roman client king, was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. And he is the man who initiated the massive expansion and renovation of the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
It is a staggering historical paradox.
The holiest site in Judaism was built by the quote-unquote cursed brothers lineage.
Yeah. The absolute epicenter of their religious, cultural, and political world during the first century was financed and constructed by a descendant of Esau, the brother who was supposedly cast out of the covenant.
The cognitive dissonance of that reality must have been just unbearable for the religious authorities of the time.
It was. It was so uncomfortable that the text details how later rabbinic traditions had to develop a coping mechanism. They couldn't change the history, so they changed the symbolism.
What did they do?
They began mapping the archetype of Edom directly onto the Roman Empire.
But structurally, how do you justify linking a desert kingdom to a European empire?
You focus on the archetype rather than geography. In Jewish tradition, Esau became the spiritual ancestor of Rome. They took Isaac's secondary blessing to Esau, "By your sword you shall live," and linked it directly to the Pax Romana.
Ah, the violent, military-enforced peace of the Roman legions.
Exactly. They even drew parallels between Esau and Jacob fighting in the womb and the myth of Romulus and Remus.
The mythic twins who founded Rome through a bloody fratricide.
Yes. They basically just took the ancient family trauma and copy-pasted it onto their current geopolitical oppressors.
Rome became Edom because the archetype fit perfectly.
Right.
A worldly, violently powerful, materially obsessed empire that was actively oppressing the spiritual covenant people.
Right. It provided a vital theological framework for the people to understand their suffering under Roman occupation.
Sure, it makes sense why they did it.
But the tragic consequence is that in doing so, it completely erased the actual historical Edomites. A vibrant, complex civilization was flattened into a permanent two-dimensional symbol for, quote-unquote, the enemy.
Which brings us to you, the listener. Why should you care about a Bronze Age family dispute, genetic probabilities, and some ancient Roman symbolism? Because this exact mechanism, this tool of genetic, political, and religious scapegoating is not a relic of the past. It is a playbook still being actively used today.
Absolutely. Whenever you see a modern group of people being demonized using ancient mythic archetypes, whenever you see a complex civilization reduced to a single flattened word of villainy just to justify excluding them, marginalizing them, or going to war with them, you are watching the Esau playbook in action.
So what does this all mean? It means we have an obligation to constantly ask ourselves, who benefits from the stories we're being told? Who is holding the pen, and what are they trying to justify?
We have to cultivate the habit of looking past the theological or ideological framing to see the human power dynamics underneath. You always have to ask who is being silenced to make the victor's narrative work.
I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We started by talking about history as a heavily edited PR ledger. Think back to Rebecca. If an entire religious and historical tradition possesses the power to take a mother's desperate, terrifying attempt to protect her disabled child, and successfully spin that trauma into a story of villainous, deceitful scheming just to protect a legal loophole for male property inheritance. What other foundational stories in our modern world, the ones we build our entire societies on, are just PR spin hiding a much darker, much more human reality?